joined now by someone who started off in production, working on series like Secret Army, The Uneeden Line, Shoestring, but moved more into props as she continued at the BBC, working on series like Are You Being Served, and most recently, Holby City. So I'd like to introduce Assistant Floor Manager, Pauline Seager. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much, yes.
And are you keeping yourself busy through all of this?
I'm more or less retired these days, but I do the occasional job every now and again.
Well, I wanted to take you back to 1983 when we first encountered Doctor Who as an assistant floor manager. What does an AFM do, or I suppose did?
Well, an AFM in those days was a complete mixture of the jobs that are still around, but we did them all. So the equivalent, you were the equivalent of a second assistant director, and you were also responsible for making sure the action props, the hand props, were around, as well as compiling the lists. You ran the rehearsal rooms and a general dog's body, basically. There were only 4 of you in the production team. So you were the production manager, assistant, and I think in those days, they were still called production assistants. And the production assistants now, who are the coordinators, were called director's assistants. So yes, a little bit of a change, yes.
And would that have been a fairly early job for you as an AFM?
No, it was came right at the end of my career as an AFM, the Doctor Who. I left drama department at the end of 1983. So no, it was one of the final things I did.
Because it must have been a particularly complicated show, because not only do you have actors, but you also have people in suits, prosthetics, video effects. There's a lot of elements that I imagine other shows don't have.
Yes, they are. There was all that sort of job still went on. And you had to coordinate between all of them so they all knew what they were doing. There weren't call sheets in those days, so the production manager's schedule was, is what you went from. And you just did the daily calls to the actors, but mainly you stayed on schedule. But we were filming in the studio. I don't remember much about the studio, to be honest. I remember more about the filming because we filmed in a sort of disused slate mine in North Wales, and it was filthy dirty. I can remember that, but it was also very steep. And in order to get everyone up there, including the actors and the extras, I was given a 4-wheel drive Peugeot estate, and it was my first job in the morning was to collect the Cybermen and take them up the mountain. So that was quite fun, sort of carting a whole load of costumed Cybermen up the side of the mountain.
Because it must have been fairly uncommon for the BBC to be that far away from London for what was a London-based show.
No, not necessarily, because before, Uneeden Line was filmed down in Cornwall and Gloucester. There was a whole spate of shows that virtually did all their filming in Cornwall. My Cousin Rachel, which I did, I filmed in Cornwall. So there was a lot of filming went on. In fact, I think I knew Cornwall better than I knew London at one stage. I was always going up and down, between the two. But yeah.
I know about thinking on Doctor Who, one of the people you're working with was Jeremy Silverton, who you would then work with later on.
Yes. Was Jeremy the production manager? Was he?
Yes, he's production manager on that story.
Yes, he was. I was trying to think earlier. Was it Jeremy who did? And yes, you're right. No, I'd worked with Jeremy on My Cousin Rachel. I was his assistant on that. So obviously we went on to Doctor Who shortly afterwards, I think. And he obviously liked me, otherwise he wouldn't have kept me. So, yeah, we did My Cousin Rachel, then I did a stint of Nanny, and then Doctor Who. So, yeah, I'd worked with him the previous year.
So would it be fairly common that the production manager, AFM, those people work together, or was that more of a fluke?
It was a bit more of a fluke. I mean, obviously, if you got on with them and they got a nice show, they sort of get in quick on the allocation business, and sort of say, oh, is so-and-so free. But we were definitely allocated by the office in serials.
And am I right in thinking that your time as driving the Cybermen around didn't always go to plan at the end of the day?
Well, one episode came to mind where we were up the mountain and they were in the car, the Cybermen were in the car, and I was off doing whatever I was doing, queuing artists and I came back at the end of the day to drive everyone back down to find that the battery on the car was completely flat. And fortunately, they owned up and they said, oh, I'm really sorry, but we've had the radio on. And they said, caused flat battery because it'd been parked all day. And they decided they wanted a bit of music or whatever. Anyway, we had to get towed down the mountain. So, yes, I weren't best pleased with them, but that's filming. They were very contrite.
Because that was a time when there seemed to be a lot of science fiction at the BBC, things like Doctor Who, Tripods, Blake 7. Were they particularly good learning grounds for anybody in production?
Well, there was a lot of elements attached to it in sort of from the design through to the special effects. And it took a lot of just generally organisation, I suppose you'd call it, so that everything came together. I think CSO was just coming out, or it had been out, and they were trying something else on Tripods, the name of which I can't remember, but it was a sort of cutout thing. And that was quite new, and that was also an OB as opposed to filming. So it was a much bigger circus that was going around. So everybody was learning from that. But obviously the Tripods were these huge machines that were this big. And so they were overlaid, onto our particular scene. But yeah, so there was a lot of organisation.
And as an AFM, would you have been involved with things like the model shots, which I imagine would have been done at a later date?
Not particularly, no. No, I wouldn't have been. That would have been done in post. And once the filming studios had come to an end, we were, virtually off the show. So no, we wouldn't have been involved in putting the model shots together.
As an AFM, you worked on some fantastic period pieces, things like The Uneeden Line, Secret Army. Was it working on those that sort of first interested you in the prop side of things?
Well, on those two, I was still a director's assistant on those two. It wasn't until I actually became an AFM that I started to think that there was more to life than production, and I really used to like working with the designers, and I liked that element of you know, sort of sorting out the action props that the actors were going to use, although I wasn't then responsible for choosing them. But I was also becoming slightly, what's the word? Not disorientated, but disillusioned with production. I would find that I was, although there were different shows, so it was always different every time, different problems. But it was very, very similar. You know, you got there, you broke the script down, you went out to rehearsals, you know, you called the artist. And I just didn't feel as if I was being fulfilled. So when the opportunity came, I debunked and went over to the prop buying department. And that was in 1984. And they trained you up. And fortunately, in those days, BBC was very good at allowing you to go off and try something new. And I found that I really liked it. I really liked the atmosphere. And I really liked the range, because I started working on what they used to call smaller shows. And so I did a lot of comedy and studio audience stuff, which I'd never done before. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed doing those things like Hello, Hello, Are You Being Served, Heidi High. I really, really loved doing it. And the props on those, obviously, you always had something wacky, you know, to either get made or, you know, that sort of thing. So it was good from that point of view, and it kept my interest. And I find even now, having done that job for 30 odd years, even now there'll be something that I need to find out about, you know, to research or what. It's a lot easier these days with the internet, but there's always something challenging that you have to sort out. So I'm very glad I made that decision to go, because I don't think I would have lasted much longer in production.
Because I imagine you say, you know, you work on period pieces, or you must have to become quite a historian for, you know, something like Hello, Hello, that period in the war. Was that history is always something that interested you?
Yes, it has. But obviously with prop buying, it's much more to do with historical furniture and colours and what have you. And there are lots of hire companies that can specialise in period stuff. So you'd have Louis Kahns, or you'd have you know, the Robin Hood stuff, or Tudor. So, you know, you had to know which companies you could go to find what you wanted, and you were always on a deadline, and you were always on a budget as well. That was something else that you know, as the buyer, you were responsible for making sure that the budget didn't overrun.
So who would have been some of the designers or people you particularly learned from then in terms of props?
Well, I found my CV. So let me get to the right page. So I worked with a lovely guy. The last job I did at the BBC in 1997 was with a lovely guy called George Kyriakides. And we had worked together on Casualty, actually. And we did The Phoenix and the Carpet, which was an E. Nesbit story set at the turn of the 20th century. And that was my last job. So and we are still friends. He still sends me emails. He sent me an email the other day of us, actually, Ben, sitting in a restaurant grinning our heads off, sent me that. So, and George was also the senior designer when I went over to Holby much, much later, because I virtually finished my career just doing bits and pieces at Holby City. So, yeah. But I mean, from a BBC point of view, he stands out. Candy Otten. Let's have a John Bristow. John Asbridge, who's still around. And these people, because they get employed by production and then they look out for people who they want to work with. So you do get quite a rapport, if they know you, it's so much easier. And then I did a very, very long stint with a lovely guy called, isn't it awful? This is my brain now. It's going. Do I can't find it. What was his name? I think I'm looking in the wrong thing. Anyway, I worked with him for a long time, and the name will come, don't worry. And we ended up going over to Bulgaria together, and I was set decorating Expendables 2, which was an education in itself. So you're never too old to learn, are you? I'd never done anything like that before. But it was an education, it was an experience. But I didn't particularly like being in Bulgaria for 6 months. So I was quite pleased when I got back here. The Hollywood Circus is completely different.
How was television, or I suppose, how does your role within television changed since you started in props to now? Because I get the impression that, with HD, everything seems to be on a larger scale and more lavish. Is that something you particularly felt?
I don't think the job has changed because it's HD, because we always tried to get things that were authentic. No, I don't think it's changed because of that. It's got a lot busier. We're now a bigger department in that when you're working on shows now, you'd have a department, say, of 7 or 8, with a petty cash buyer, and you'd have a couple of art department assistants, construction, designer, set decorator, prop buyer, graphics, because you generate the whole thing. And I think now all the independent companies are very wary of copyright and permission to use paintings and what is and what isn't out of copyright. So you have to be so careful, because everything, if you think about it, is was designed by somebody. So you have to be really careful, and that can be a pain, but you just have to do it.
Recently you've gone into things like Downton Abbey, which must be a fantastic job to work on, because you've got that wonderfully rich period look, but also each series moves on a little bit.
Yes, the one I did was in 1920, and it is lavish, and you do go to some absolutely wonderful places. That's the great thing about the job, actually, is when you go on location, you'll go to these wonderful, wonderful houses that you haven't got hope in hell of going round as a visitor. And you're seeing, and usually there's somebody there that will tell you all about stuff. And so, yes, so even though you start at sort of 5 o'clock in the morning, It is lovely because you start earlier than anybody else virtually, because you have to get everything ready, and very often you won't get a day set out of it. You have to go in. Depends. But you would virtually have to go in, very early and get everything sorted before people came on set. But I do have a lovely photograph of me sitting in the throne that we made for they were doing a debutantes audience thing that they used to go to the king and queen, and so construction made the thrones, and it was one particular day when we were waiting for everybody else to come. We'd done the set, and so there's a photograph of me sitting in one of these thrones. So that's the nice part of it, and also you tend to get off earlier as well because you start so blooming early. Once your work is done and you haven't got anything else to do, say on that Sunday, you can actually go home. You don't have to do the get out.
And I suppose it's the 1920s a particularly interesting period to work in. Are some more of a challenge than others?
No, I love doing period stuff. Don't, and it's not that difficult if you know where to go. We'll go to a location. They'll say, okay, on the recce, and they go, okay, we're going to use this room for this scene, and so it'll get drawn up. And we'll look to see what's there, how much we've got to do, whether we've got to get the painters in or whether we've got to do, take measurements of windows, etc., where we can put. But basically, on the recce, they'll show us where the camera's going to be, and where it's, So we will then prop to that. But 1920s is not bad because there were quite a few hire companies that have got all that period, those period carpets, period tables, chairs and things. I think, because I did quiz last year, which was set from 1997 through to 2003. Now, technically, a lot happened in those days. You should see the phones for 1997. Now, because it's so close to where we are, they are dreadful to try and get and to work. That is the awful thing. You might be able to hire a phone, but if you want it to light up because somebody's calling you, it was the devil's own job. Get them charged. So we'd buy phones, on eBay. We'd buy the phones and then we'd try and get them working. So that was, I think that period was harder because it's such, you think when something happened and you think, oh yeah, well, when did Apple phones come out? Well, they didn't come out till 2005, I think, first iPhone. So we couldn't use that, so you're back to Nokias and those little blue. So that was challenging. I think that was more challenging than doing doing 1920s or an 18th century piece.
And am I right in thinking you were responsible for setting up Casualty?
Yes, that was one of the first jobs I did when I was a prop buyer, and I think it was 1985. And I knew Geraint because I'd worked with him on a needling line. But he came to the office and was asking who was free, obviously, because again, we got allocated. I had to have an interview with him, but I mean, because I knew him, it wasn't really an interview. I was his assistant for 9 months, so I knew him quite well. And anyway, he asked me if I'd do it, and so I did. So I set it up, and in those days, the studio element was in London, in the London studios, and the filming element was down in Bristol. And so I split my time between the two, but it was quite difficult to get, because it was going to be a long-running series. They wanted me to buy everything as opposed to just hire. So it was sourcing the hospital props that I could buy that would then stay with the show. So as quite a junior prop buyer, because I'd only been doing the job a year, it was quite a challenge for me, that one. But I did enjoy it. And Geraint and Michael were lovely to work with again. It was just...
Well, I think we've touched upon many jobs that you've done, and you clearly enjoyed such a range in your work. I'd just like to thank you very much for your time, Pauline. It's been fantastic to touch upon just some of the things that you worked on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. My pleasure.